Hello and welcome. I'm James Derian, the director of the Center for International Security Studies here at the University of Sydney. And I'm delighted to have with us today Professor Hugh Gusterson, who's a professor of anthropology and public policy at the University of British Columbia. Before that, he was in the United States of America. He made his exodus at a propitious time, and he now is writing books on topics familiar to us here at the center. He started off his career writing about nuclear weapons, but the science of war. One book made quite a splash on nuclear rites, looking at a weapons lab in California where the bomb was being made, or certainly all of the theoretical aspects of it were being designed into weaponry. He followed up with that with a couple other books on nuclear decision-making, but also why do academics or pundits get it wrong so often about global politics? One of my favorite books. And it's practically the anniversary of, I think, almost 30 years of nuclear rights. And we'll talk about that a bit. Hugh's gone on to do work on drones and also the history of the lie detector. And so we're looking forward to touching on all these topics, but looming large in our discussion, of course, is the fact we're at war. War, as the President of the United States like to say, this excursion has now lasted close to a month, and we're just waiting to see if another shoe's going to drop. We're going to be talking mainly today about nuclear issues because that's been the theme of CISS Conversations. This is our 7th CISS Conversations. And prior to this one, we had Peter Katzenstein from Cornell, and he talked quite a bit about the Cuban Missile Crisis, how close we really did get, in spite of the mythology that was just a couple of bright men who saved the day. But most recently, Hugh's been looking at really how rocky the road has been towards controlling, and not just nuclear nonproliferation, but also the circumstances and situations under which conditions can ratchet up to crises. So we're very fortunate today to have Professor Gusterson talking about this. But before we get deep into it, we usually give our speakers an opportunity to tell us a little how you got here. What was your intellectual journey to these nuclear issues, to the science of war, to militarism, through uncommon route? I mean, you are an interdisciplinary scholar, but you were trained primarily in anthropology, am I right?
Yes.
Okay.
So before I went to graduate school to do my PhD in anthropology, I took a few years off. This was in the early, mid-1980s, and I worked on the staff of the Nuclear Weapons Freeze campaign.
Okay.
So I was a paid professional anti-nuclear activist in San Francisco, which is an hour away from one of the 2 nuclear weapons labs in the US, an hour away from the Livermore lab, which designed the warhead for the MX missile and things like that. One day I was sent out to a local high school to debate a local nuclear weapons scientist. And this is before I went back to grad school, but I found myself fascinated by him. I was supposed to try and wipe him out argumentatively, but I found that I was more interested in understanding where he was coming from. He seemed like a strange sort of anthropological object to me. Yeah. And I felt bad for him. He had a cold, he wasn't feeling well. The class was entirely on my side, a liberal San Francisco high school class. They practically jeered him. So I felt some sympathy for him. And actually, when I did my field work, he became a good friend. So I went to graduate school in the San Francisco Bay Area at Stanford. I was an Africanist at that time, and I applied to do field work in Africa. And I began to realize that what was calling to me was to study my own personal other, which was nuclear weapons scientists. And I was very fortunate that it was a very avant-garde program. Most PhD programs in anthropology at that time, in the mid-'80s, would have laughed at me and told me to stay with Africa when I said I wanted to do field work at a nuclear weapons lab. But I had some forward-looking faculty who said, that's a little out there, but give it a try and see how it goes. So I moved to the town of Livermore, which is about an hour away. I spent 2 years living in town. I lived in the shared housing with different nuclear weapons scientists. I went to church every Sunday to try and meet weapons scientists. I joined the lab softball team. I joined their hiking group. And I went to bars and tried to meet people at the lab that way. I tried to do what we call participant observation in anthropology, which is sort of deep hanging out. And I collected probably 100 life histories from weapons scientists. I'd show up with a tape recorder in their homes, and they would explain to me how they decided they had a calling to work on nuclear weapons, the satisfaction that they got from that over their careers, how it affected their family life, which is often not well, because they couldn't tell their spouse why they were in a bad mood that day. It had to do with secret stuff and so on. And so I ended up writing this first book. And at the moment, I'm putting the finishing touches on a sequel to that, on what happened to the weapons labs after the Cold War. Life didn't change at all in some ways, and it changed quite fundamentally in other ways. They lost nuclear testing, which was their central scientific experiment, and to me, their central collective ritual, but they managed to substitute for it. If I can add one more thing, when you were introducing me, you mentioned that we're having this conversation at a moment when the US is in the 4th week of its war against Iran. In the past, I've written about something I call nuclear Orientalism, which is the sense that American pundits and defense policymakers have that nuclear weapons are fine in the hands of white people, like Americans, British, the French. The Russians are now honorary white people. Even the Chinese have become honorary white people. But the worst thing would be if black and brown people had them and if Arabs had them. The US went to war against Iraq over false claims that Iraq was close to acquiring nuclear weapons. As someone who follows this, I can tell you that Trump is absolutely lying when he said that Iran was anywhere close to getting nuclear weapons. They were at least a year away. But American policymakers have learned that if you want to gin up support for a war in the Middle East, you claim that who you're attacking is about to get nuclear weapons. And it appeals to a kind of nuclear racism that is sadly quite endemic.
Well, we're going to get back, I think, onto that topic because I've always been interested in how attempts to control, nuclear weapons had an element of nuclear colonialism to it, and I want to revisit that one from the 50s onwards. I wanted something else that I want to touch on that you just raised, that you largely got started into anthropology because you felt some sympathy for the other. But it was also for the sympathy within, perhaps, of the other we all have, call it our, if history or personal circumstances had nudged us in a different direction. So you have an empathy, and that makes for good anthropology. But my question is, and it's one that was raised, I read something by Clifford Geertz, the renowned anthropologist, who says, there's a lot of people say, you shouldn't have empathy. But he was more in your school, that was important to have some sort of connection to your informant, that true objectivity makes you a lesser scholar and a lesser human being. So you seem to be more of the school of Geertz than, say, the more analytic, positivist anthropologists who collect a lot of data. Would that be a fair?
It is, and I think most anthropologists practice the cultivation of relationships. I mean, what's unique about anthropology is we don't go to newspapers and case histories to read about people. We don't go into archives. We cultivate intimate personal relationships with people. We might not take notes when we're having dinner with someone, but we rush home and we write up what we remember from the conversation. And we try and encourage people to trust us. Around the time that I was in graduate school, anthropologists became interested in what they call studying up. And what I did is an example of studying up. So anthropologists traditionally had studied people in ghettos, peasants, hunter-gatherers, and so on. We studied down. We studied people with less power than we had. And Laura Nader, the famous anthropologist, Ralph Nader's sister, wrote an article appealing for anthropologists to do critical studying up, to practice their methodology, getting to know people who had a lot of power. She suggested bankers, people in the insurance industry, politicians, and so on, and then writing critical ethnographies of them. And what I did is an example of studying up, but there's a real friction at the very heart of that project, which is that our methodology is to get people to trust us, right?
Yes.
And for me personally, if I got the weapons scientists to trust me, and then I said, oh, they're all in denial, they're going to end civilization, they're terrible people, I would feel that at a very personal level I'd betrayed them. So the trick when you study up is to somehow balance an empathic sense of explaining how they are, how they got to be who they are, with the ability to do critique.
Now, I am sympathetic to that approach and viewpoint, and indeed have practiced it when I've embedded with Marines at 29 Palms going through training about cultural awareness before they go off to Fallujah to fight a misbegotten war. And also at Fort Irwin with the Army, where they were trying to learn how to deal with technology, digital exercises. But it's amazing how often when I would present my research, and I wonder if this is something you experienced, via a book or increasingly through documentary film, the criticism would be thrown at me, well, you lost your objectivity.
Thrown at you by whom?
My peers.
Your
Disciplinary
allies, your
peers.
ideological allies? Or?
Well, no. Well, interestingly enough, if you're going to put a left-right on it or a methodological, ideological, sometimes there was a narcissism of petty differences. Sometimes you would think the people closest to my political viewpoints would attack, this approach. My God, you were talking to the enemy. You were, sleeping with them, eating MREs, meals ready to eat with them. How could you not go native? Can we use that term? Go native? They would critique that as well, because that's somehow the language that's no longer correct. So I'm just curious, first of all, did you suffer that criticism for some of your getting up close to these nuclear scientists? And how did you respond? But can that be transposed or translate into other disciplines?
What you're saying resonates absolutely.
Okay.
So in Nuclear Rites, I wrote this at a moment where Foucault had been discovered by anthropologists. Anthropologists always had a tradition of cultural relativism. To me, Foucault tripled that or quadrupled it. So he gave me a vocabulary for saying that weapons scientists had their particular construction of reality and anti-nuclear activists had an opposed construction of reality. And I was going to explore both constructions, but like a good Foucauldian, I was not going to say objectively this one is right and this one is wrong. When the book came out, I, in an experimental mode, invited people I'd interviewed, I gave them a page each at the back, and invited them to respond to the book. The weapons scientists said, I can live with that relativism. The activists have their way of constructing it, and I have my way. That's fine. Yeah. And they had the power, right?
Yeah.
So they can do that. The activists said, he used to be one of us, and now he isn't.
Okay.
Because all they had was truth, right? That was the only power they had, to say that the other side was wrong. Right. And I had taken that away from them. Yeah. So strangely enough, although I still consider myself to be anti-nuclear, my former comrades against arms saw me as having sold out the cause.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
I might add, by the
history
way,
will judge that one. History will judge that one.
I might add that the perspective I'm articulating is an old man's perspective in anthropology.
Okay.
A younger generation studying up has rediscovered truth.
Yeah.
And the new way of doing critical anthropology is to say the other side is wrong. So I think younger anthropologists would not be so comfortable with the way I've been doing it.
Well, one of the hardest things, I think, is being part of a tribe. You can have in-groups, out-groups of any tribe, and certainly academic disciplines can be tribalistic, sometimes in excess, because they don't have power, as you said. They cling to this notion that they have something else as powerful, the truth. Mm-hmm. Foucault, very great in showing the interrelationships of truth and power and how every new form of power produces new forms of resistance, and I assume that's going to keep on happening generationally. Now, you've gone back to this theme. This is my segue, to look more almost in an empirical, political light on what's happened since. We had the end of the Cold War. You would have thought a peace dividend, a drawdown. There was certainly the START treaties, the Nonproliferation treaties, and yet we just saw start to
wither away,
disappear, just lapsed by time, wasn't renewed. No will by Putin, no will by Trump to renew it. All sorts of specious arguments being given, well, it's because we want to bring China in to this new omnibus agreement, which will never happen, probably in our lifetimes. But also proliferation now is taking it on the chin. Mm-hmm. Now, you've studied it up close. Tell us a little bit about why we got this amazing treaty on nonproliferation and why it's in so much jeopardy now.
I don't know how much jeopardy it is in.
Okay.
I mean, the new project that I've almost finished writing up looks at what happened to U.S. national policy and to the weapons labs between 1989 and around 1997. The nuclear test ban treaty was signed in 96, so that's almost the end point of this. Some of it's based on continuing fieldwork with the weapons labs, that I did during the summer. And immediately after the Cold War, they were desperate. Lots of people took early retirement. There were serious concerns that one of the weapons labs would close because funding was being taken away and so many people were quitting. But I also did a lot of interviews with people in Washington. When I say people, I'm talking about cabinet members, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, people like that. The book is written almost like a journalistic account, more than an ethnography, trying to piece together the story of how the weapons labs lost nuclear testing. At the end of the Cold War, they really wanted to hold on to it. It was their central experimental practice, and there was something emotionally transcendent about a nuclear test. It brought together everyone at the labs in a ritualistic kind of way. So they did want to hold on to nuclear testing if they could. For 30 years, the anti-nuclear movement had made ending nuclear testing its primary goal. And now that the Cold War was over, they saw a chance to do this. So the big central battle in arms control was over whether there would be a test ban. If there was, would it be a complete zero-yield test ban, or would it allow little tiny tests, which is what the weapons labs wanted, maybe a kiloton, maybe 100 tons, whatever. And the Nonproliferation Treaty became an important part of that debate. So countries that had signed the Nonproliferation Treaty in 1968 had insisted that after 25 years, that's 1995, that it would come up for a 25-year renewal or an indefinite renewal. And they were insisting that if the existing nuclear powers kept testing nuclear weapons, they would not indefinitely extend the Nonproliferation Treaty. So the possibility of a nuclear test ban and the continuation of the nonproliferation regime became intimately interwoven with one another. And policymakers and members of Congress in Washington really wanted to prevent proliferation and to get an indefinite extension of the Nonproliferation Treaty. They wanted to hold on to nuclear testing if they could, but they began to realize that that was going to be very difficult. So there's this interesting sort of bargaining process between members of Congress, members of the national security bureaucracy, and different agencies in the national security bureaucracy don't see it the same way, and the weapons labs over whether nuclear testing would continue. Could it be just a few tests? Could it be very small tests? Did they have to give it up completely? And so that's what I largely explored.
Okay. Now, this story has a hero, the heroine, the energy secretary under Clinton.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about her.
So Hazel O'Leary had been a utility company CEO when she was appointed. Black woman, first black woman ever to be energy secretary. Very few people had really heard of her. She was an unknown quantity when she was appointed. People assumed that she knew about energy, but not about nuclear weapons, though she was responsible for running the weapons labs, and that she would just do what the weapons labs told her. They were absolutely, completely wrong. I spent months trying to get her to talk to me. She ignored all of my emails. This is after she'd retired. And eventually I'm in Washington, D.C., and I get this email. You have been very persistent. Let's meet at Starbucks. I will give you an hour.
Wow.
So we met in a Starbucks. It's the most amazing interview I ever did in my whole career. Wow. And I talked to other people about her as well. So there was a meeting in about 1993. Congress had passed legislation that there would be a brief 9-month moratorium on nuclear testing, and then the nuclear weapons labs would be allowed to do 15 tests to sort out reliability and safety issues. And a lot of anti-nuclear people were concerned that if they got to do those tests, testing would just resume and never end, and it would destroy the non-proliferation regime. So there's a meeting where the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Energy, the National Security Advisor, the White House Science Advisor, and the head of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency are talking about whether to actually do the 15 tests. And the people who are really against it are very weak. White House Science Advisor, Arms Control person. The Defense Department wants to do it, the National Security Advisor wants to do it, and they turn to Hazel O'Leary and say, you're on our side, right? Yeah. And she said, you know what? I don't understand this well enough. I'm not going to tell you right now. I'm going to go and talk to my weapons lab directors. Apparently they were furious. They expected her just to sign on. So she called the weapons lab directors to Washington to make the case to her for the 15 tests they wanted to do, but she blindsided them. She brought in 3 anti-nuclear physicists with security clearances and said, I want to watch you argue this out.
Okay.
And the weapons lab directors were not prepared for this, and they kind of lost the argument.
Don't you wish that we still had that kind of rational decision-making?
I absolutely do. Yeah. So she went back and said, I'm against the 15 tests.
Yeah.
And so they never happened. And then there was a second debate about whether you would have very small tests. And she did the same thing again. She brought in some university physicists with clearances and made the lab directors argue in front of these other physicists. And what came out of it in the end is that there was not a coherent case for doing those tests. And it turned out one lab wanted bigger tests, one lab wanted smaller ones. The scientists who worked on H-bombs wanted bigger tests than the ones who worked on the primary devices. So there was completely incoherent messaging from the weapons labs anyway. And she overruled them. And if there is a single person who should claim credit for the fact that we got a zero-yield nuclear test ban treaty, it is Hazel O'Leary.
There was one sort of X factor, too. I remember they were starting to say, well, supercomputers, we can simulate the test. Right. You heard that quite a bit. Was that a variable or not? Was that more?
It was. So I haven't given you another dimension of the story. A bargain was made with the weapons labs. So in one of these meetings where they're arguing with the anti-nuclear physicists, one of the lab directors looks at Hazel O'Leary and said, if you give us as much money not to test the weapons as you gave us to test them, we can develop new technologies. And I'm sure we can make sure the weapons are safe and reliable. And so a bargain was made that the weapons labs would get supercomputers, the most powerful laser in the world, which is now up and running at Livermore, and other kinds of experimental facilities to simulate components of a nuclear test. The weapons labs now employ more people than they have ever employed in their history. The weapons scientists I talked to are quite happy. They say they're doing interesting physics. They say they're confident that the weapons are reliable. So no more nuclear testing, and the labs are happy. It's a fairy tale ending.
Well, fairy tale, but also someone like Graham Allison in my field would say, this is all about bureaucratic infighting. It's still material interests trumping ideological interests. Do you follow that line or not?
Well, it's interesting. The anti-nuclear community had set their eyes on a nuclear test ban treaty as the prize. Their eyes were on that prize.
Yeah.
And when they got it, they didn't want it anymore. They said, the labs beat us.
Okay.
For years, that had been what they wanted.
Yeah.
And they said, the labs outwitted us. Okay. They don't need testing anymore. That was why they gave it up. And I think that has an element of truth to it, but only an element. The labs tell me that they cannot design a new weapon. You cannot be sure that a new weapons design works without building it and blowing it up.
Yeah.
So sure, they can train a new generation of weapons scientists using the supercomputers and the lasers and everything. They can tweak the designs a little bit, but they're stuck with the inventory that they have.
Well, now we're moving into the territory of 2000, 2003, where the debate takes off. Who's going to have nuclear weapons? Will Libya have them next? Will Iraq? What do we do about it? And you see this convergence of liberals, including in my discipline. Some people call them chicken hawks or liberal institutionalists, but people like Joe Nye and Anne-Marie Slaughter and others saying, we got to go in not just for the nuclear weapons, but we have to go in because these are tyrannical regimes and they're being oppressed, and we can have regime change. This is the term now that people think has just been invented by President Trump, but it's been around, with neoconservatives before, but also neoliberals. And this convergence was very, very powerful. I mean, leading up to 2003, after suffering this horrible, horrible attack, first on U.S. soil since 1812, with the Twin Towers, the Pentagon being attacked by Al-Qaeda. This was, a way to relieve, not relive, but relieve that trauma for the American, I think, population. So there was an element of, we're doing this as sort of protecting our national interest, but also as almost to somehow or another therapeutically move on. Now, as an anthropologist who's recognized sort of, you need to know the other, there seemed to be very little effort at the time to get to know the Iraqi other. It's quite remarkable. Like you heard then Hillary Clinton when running for president saying, if only we knew now what we didn't know then. Well, the knowledge was there, but they couldn't hear it, they couldn't see it. How did academics fail in sort of sounding, the alert? I tried, and got shouted down.
What is the alert? That we will never win a war?
The alert is, first of all, there's no weapons of mass destruction, which you could look at Hans Blix and others who are nonpartisan.
But the problem is the knowledge is secret, right? It's classified. So
It
we're
was
on
out
an
there.
uneven
Scott
playing
Ritter
field.
had leaked it out.
We can't participate in that debate fully.
Well, I think there was enough knowledge, and also historical knowledge. How many times have we gotten risk assessments, intelligence assessments wrong in the past, you know?
Well, once we got it wrong in the other direction. When the Russians tested in 1949, the US was astounded.
It's true.
They expected it to happen 10 years later.
Partially because of espionage, that was the case. But I think in this case, it's not like deja vu all over again, and it's not like first time tragedy, second time farce. It's like we've moved on into another cycle. It's beyond farcical, call it tragic comedy, where we're hearing the same language. They've got nuclear weapons. They've got, and you just said in your entry here that they're at least a year away, and I concur with that. He said months or days. And they also have to be able to deliver these weapons as well. Now, the other factor here is regime change, that you can just go in and bomb your way to regime change. This is, again, where historical orientation says, that hasn't worked in the past. Why aren't we learning any lessons from any of these past?
I wish you could tell me. I mean, it seems blindingly obvious after Iraq and Afghanistan that what Trump is currently doing in Iran is a suicide mission. It's a fool's errand. You just have to wonder how the national security bureaucracy can replay the script and not see the problem. I mean, we don't know. Maybe they warned him that this would happen and he overruled them. I can imagine that happening. But you have to wonder why on earth they haven't learned their lesson. Maybe they will this time. I don't know.
Yeah.
I will say, in terms of liberating us from the threat of proliferation, one route is the sort of liberal hawk route, where you do regime change in Libya, Iraq, wherever. But there is a leftist internationalist route. There is a treaty to abolish nuclear weapons that over half the nations in the world have signed. Now, none of the nations who have nuclear weapons have signed it, and I'll concede that you have verification issues that would have to be solved before I would be happy with my country giving up nuclear weapons. But there is another way to getting to a world where you're not afraid of nuclear proliferation, and that's to sign on to the abolitionist treaty. One more thing, in terms of getting to know the other, during the Cold War, the Soviets were a very mysterious other. After the end of the Cold War, American and Russian weapons designers became best buddies. I remember sitting at the public cafeteria at the Los Alamos lab. Anyone can go and eat lunch there. I'm sitting there and I'm hearing Russian at the next table because they have a delegation visiting from one of the Russian weapons labs. The director of weapons development at Los Alamos had taught himself fluent Russian, and they're nattering away to each other in Russia. I went to Russia to interview some Russian weapons scientists, and they just wanted to hear about their American colleagues. They wanted to meet them. They had the sense that although they didn't know each other, they had cooperated in keeping the world stable through the Cold War. And they wanted to hear from me, so-and-so, what's he like? What is it like when you go into Livermore? What's it like when you go into Los Alamos? So they went from being worst enemies to best buddies.
Well, this raises the question of, we started with the premise proliferation is bad, nuclear non-proliferation good, but if it has kept the peace, and that's a relative concept because all you've done is displace violence into the peripheries of the Cold War, tension and conflict to Vietnam, Korea, Africa. But what if, again, South Korea goes nuclear, Japan goes nuclear, Australia goes nuclear? These are actually being debated in foreign policy journals right now in this region of the world. You don't have to be a John Mearsheimer or somebody else to at least entertain the notion that there might be more, if not, there'll be order, if not more justice to the international system, or stability. Do you buy that thesis or
I mean, I'm no expert in game theory, but it seems as a common sense proposition to me that the more players you have, the more complicated and unpredictable the game becomes.
Yes.
So I don't care who the countries are, whether they're black and brown people or more white people, the game will become more unstable. the more players that you have.
This was, I think, Kissinger's point when he signed on to the abolitionist treaty. We have people like Henry Kissinger, former secretaries of defense, and others signing on to this, saying, it's time to seriously talk about getting rid of nuclear weapons instead of talking about proliferation.
Now, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that Trump has done unspeakable damage to the non-proliferation regime. I mean, NATO allies now can't trust the US not to attack them if he decides he wants Greenland, and they can't trust the US to protect them if they're attacked. So if I were Dutch or Spanish or Italian, I'd be wondering whether I should go nuclear, right? If I were Iranian, I would definitely be trying to go nuclear, so I'm not attacked a third time. In a disordered world where alliances are less reliable, people resort to self-help, right?
Yeah.
So I think Trump has done enormous damage to the American system of alliances and to trust and predictability in the international system. I might add that the danger from nuclear weapons is not just that a country will deliberately use them or get maneuvered, pressured into using them. There's also the danger of accident.
And miscalculation, yes.
Well, but a plane dropping one by accident.
Yeah.
Off the coast of Spain, there are 2 nuclear weapons that the US dropped in the 60s that it still hasn't managed to find.
Yeah.
In South Dakota in the 1950s, a B-52 caught fire on the runway with nuclear weapons on board. The weapons labs now think that if the wind had been blowing in the other direction, there would have been an explosion of the nuclear weapons on board.
Yeah.
I live in British Columbia, where the US used to have nuclear weapons. They dropped one by accident on British Columbia. It didn't blow up, but it could have done. How many accidents can you have before there are really serious consequences to one of them? The safety mechanisms fail or whatever.
Yeah, and that certainly increases with proliferation. And certainly with nuclear command and control no longer being safeguarded, with AI now being introduced into this, sort of saying it's faster, take humans out of the loop, make it more stable. Well, that also sounds like a recipe for an accident waiting to happen.
And in terms of just physical accidents handling the weapons, I don't have a clearance, so I don't know the details. But as I understand it, a first-generation nuclear weapon, you're just concerned with being sure it'll blow up.
Yeah.
You press the button. It takes years or decades of experience and advanced knowledge to figure out how to make them so that bits of the weapon are shielded from other bits of the weapons, so that if there's an accident in one bit, it doesn't create a detonation.
Fail-safes. Yeah.
So, if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, it's not going to have those safety features.
Yeah. Well, we don't like ending on a doomsday note, but it's hard talking, about nuclear weapons not to have always Armageddon on the horizon. And you've worked with the Atomic Bulletin of Scientists for some period of time. You've written for them. And you've seen that clock tick down. It's now down to 85 seconds to midnight. It's not just nuclear, but other threats and cataclysmic disasters out there. What will it take to bring that second hand back again?
That's a good question. I mean, my fear is it takes some sort of disaster.
Yeah.
After 3 Mile Island, the nuclear industry learned to design nuclear energy facilities so they were less accident prone. So my fear is it might take losing a city or something like that. We can hope that when Trump is gone, which I believe will be sooner rather than later, that we will get new leadership that will behave more like the old leadership, that leaders around the globe will say, this was terrifying, what happened under Trump, and we have to get together and redesign the global order. That's a possibility. I don't know how likely it is. So I'm not going to make any predictions.
Okay. Well, we always end on with a control question. We ask all our guests this because this 2026, we're really centering on the nuclear threat as our theme. But do you think in your lifetime there will be an exchange or the use of a nuclear weapon?
I think it's 50-50.
50-50. Okay. I was about to say I could live with that, but I'm not quite so sure I will. I want to thank you very much for giving us not just incredible historical overview of how we got here, but where the light might come in the future, and also the importance of individuals. Someone like Hazel O'Leary, that can turn things around that look desperate and inevitable. So the role of individualism, but also the collective actions of the anti-nuclear movement that you've often cited as putting pressure from below. And the importance, though, to not be afraid of doing anthropology upwards. Very important. But God forbid, I would never, never want to have to do an ethnography of a cabinet meeting of the Trump administration. I mean, that would be my...
It would be fascinating.
Okay. Where fools fear to tread. Angels fear to tread. In that case, I hope we can have you back, and we'll be able to collect on that 50-50 bet in years to come. And thank you for coming from the University of British Columbia to the University of Sydney for CISS Conversations. And thank you. And
thank you for inviting me. It was a fascinating conversation.
Good. Well, we hope to have you back, definitely, in this lifetime. All right. Thank you. Over and out.